Okay, let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. It is just 3 minutes after 1:30. Item number 2 on the agenda, public comment. We have, it looks like about 14 folks with us today. Is there any public comment at this point? Okay, not seeing any. Let's, Emily, are you with us now? Okay, let's skip item number 3 on the agenda, which is approval of the December 9th meeting minutes. Let's move to number 4, budget and schedule update. Gordon, can you give us an update, please?
Yep, will do. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to look at the updated chart. So the only big probably expense this month was we finally got caught, or Todd finally got caught up with their invoicing for Woodard and Kern's modeling. So the basin setting graph there is the one that is updated the most. And so far we're at, we've spent 50% of our budget, and we've spent 63% of the time allotted in our schedule. So that's where we are today.
Thank you, Gordon. Are there any questions for Gordon with respect to budget and schedule? Okay, seeing none. Let's move on to number 5 on the agenda today, public outreach update. Sam, do you have an update for us?
You're on mute.
We can't hear you, Sam.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry, new laptop, so I'm still getting used to it. As part of the agenda packet today, you may have seen a Modesto Interlock Subbasin fact sheet. We are working on that in collaboration with Turlock Groundwater, just to use for future pieces and to encourage interbasin coordination. So if the member agencies and members of the public want to take a look, if you have any feedback, feel free to pass that my way or to Gordon. Turlock is also going to be doing the same thing. Once finalized, it'll be posted to our website. And I'm also thinking that we'll just take the Modesto Subbasin specific material and create that into our own fact sheet to accompany it as well. But hopefully this will be a helpful piece moving forward. Also, just something I want the group to start thinking about is an upcoming newsletter. Maybe just start thinking of some ideas that we can include, maybe work on one for early spring. I believe the last one we published was in October. It maybe will end up coinciding with a future public workshop, but I just wanted to throw it out there to get everyone thinking about it. And then lastly, we do stand by for a future public workshop whenever the group is ready to proceed with one. We can help with whatever communication pieces be needed. And then Gordon, I'm not sure if you had an update on the FSS funding.
Yeah, I will. So we met with Stantec, and we went over the scope of work for the amended facility support services contract that we have with DWR. And we revised this, we met with DWR and went over the scope, revised the scope of work a little bit, and have resubmitted it to DWR, and they're now processing it. The amendment was, the scope of work changed, just that we added a couple little things. Mostly we wanted to do some video sessions where we would go through different parts of the GSP and talk about them with members of STRGBA. And then also we've extended the contract, or amended it to extend through 2021. So those are the major changes in the agreement.
Thank you both for the update. Are there, Sam, with respect to the newsletter, I think the monitoring wells might be, Miguel, maybe if you could put something together with Liz's assistance regarding the monitoring wells and the grant program there, that seems like something that would be useful in terms of publication and letting folks know where we stand on that. But as I guess I would ask member agencies, as ideas may come to your mind, please do get those to Gordon, and then we can funnel those to Sam and get a draft put together on our side. Are there any questions for Gordon and Sam on the public outreach side of things? Okay, seeing none. It looks like Eric, are you with us, Eric?
Yeah, Mayor, sorry about that.
No problem. Let's move back up to number 3 on the agenda, if folks don't mind, which is consideration of approval of the December 9th, 2020 meeting minutes. And if folks have had the opportunity to review those minutes, can I get a motion to approve those minutes?
This is Walt. I move approval.
Thank you, Walt. Can I get a second?
I'll second it. Eric?
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. Thank you all for that. Phyllis, I see you're astutely paying attention to the agenda, which means that item number 6 is up, GSP update.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see your names and faces again. Happy New Year. For the GSP update today, we are getting ready to move very rapidly through sustainable management criteria. We're going to have an additional sort of introduction to terms today in the TAC meeting, and we're going to be moving toward selecting these criteria over the next few months. Our target is to get these done by the first quarter so that we can begin the modeling of the management actions and projects that we're also going to be talking about along the way. So we have a lot to do this year and we're going to get it done. So hang on for the ride. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Phyllis, for that. And we'll hear more from you in the Technical Advisory Committee meeting here momentarily. Liz, let's move to item number 7, monitoring well update. Can I turn to Liz and Miguel for an update with respect to where we stand?
Sure, we are rolling along. Right now, we are scheduled to begin drilling the wells the first week of February. We have contracted the drilling subcontractor, Gregory Drilling, and I've also subcontracted Ground Zero Analysis, which is a local geologic company in Modesto, to do the day-to-day field oversight during the construction of the wells. We have begun the permitting process and just yesterday filed well construction permit applications with the Stanislaus County Department of Environmental Resources for 4 locations in the Eastern Subbasin, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And shortly we'll be submitting 2 encroachment permits for locations 8 and 10, which are along Stanislaus County rights-of-way roads. So that's where we stand. And we're just a few weeks away from starting.
Thank you for that. The permits, this is a question for Walt. The permits, from my perspective, can be moved through the approval process relatively quickly. Can the same be said for the encroachment agreement? Is that something that needs to be approved or can be approved at a staff level, or does that have to go to the Board of Supes?
It can be approved at staff level also. And Liz has been working with Patty Ramirez, is it, in Public Works?
Yes.
And she could probably speak directly to how far along she is in that process.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, Liz, I just want to make sure that, and the reason I asked Walt, I want to make sure, you know, these are time-sensitive issues. I want to make sure we move towards the finish line as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I've spoken with Patty about timeframes. She thinks it'll take just about 3 days to review and approve the encroachment permits. And the well construction permit applications are less than 10 days. So I think we are in good shape. Okay,
very good. Thank you guys for that. As Phyllis mentioned, and I should have mentioned at the onset, we do have a technical advisory committee meeting, so we're moving not very quickly, but fairly quickly through to the regular meeting agenda. Move to item number 8 on the agenda, which is our next meeting of this body, the GSA. We currently have it scheduled for February the 10th, 2021 at 1:30 p.m. via Zoom. Okay, are there any items too late for today's GSA meeting? Okay, seeing none, let's adjourn the regular STRGBA GSA meeting and move into the Technical Advisory Committee meeting. It is 1:43. Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. Is there any public comment at today's TAC meeting? Doesn't look like I see any hands up. Okay, can I get item number 3 on the agenda, approval of the December 9th, 2020 meeting minutes? If everybody's had an opportunity to review those, can I get a motion to approve?
I'll make the motion.
Thank you, Eric. Can I get a second?
Yeah, I'll second Walt.
Thank you, Walt. You guys just reverse roles on me. Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Okay, any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved from our December 9th, 2020 TAC meeting. Phyllis and team, you guys are up now with respect to a presentation, introduction of sustainable management criteria.
Great, thanks so much. I am sharing my screen right now, and as soon as we pop up, we will begin. I'd like to begin by saying that the sustainable management criteria are the next step that we're moving toward for the GSP process. We've done the basin setting and the plan area, and the information and details in those documents are going to be what we will base the sustainable management criteria on. We've had 2 sort of introductory meetings, I'll call them, with respect to the sustainable management criteria, and today's is a continuation of that. Each time we're going a little bit deeper in detail, and today I'll be pulling a little bit of information from the basin setting and plan area so that we can begin to think about these terms with respect to the Modesto subbasin. So you will recall that there are 6 sustainability indicators, which are shown here with the DWR icons associated with them. I'm going to be using these throughout the presentation to keep us focused on which one we're talking about at what time. We want to make sure that each of these are applicable to the Modesto subbasin. That's something that the GSA will need to determine. And if they are applicable, not only with respect to if the conditions are applicable today, but if they might actually be applicable for the future. And using those sustainability indicators, we will begin to define undesirable results. That's generally a groundwater condition that we want to avoid. And the metrics are provided to us in the GSP regulations, and we will be using those metrics to come up with what is called minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. The minimum thresholds and measurable objectives will provide quantitative information for sustainable management. And we're going to be using the metrics that are suggested in the GSP regulations. And the metrics are things such as a water level, for example, for chronic lowering of water levels, a volume of storage for the reduction of groundwater and storage, specific water quality guidelines for degraded water quality. If seawater intrusion is determined to be applicable, it would be an isocontour of chloride. For inelastic land subsidence, we'll be looking at rates of subsidence. And for interconnected surface water, we'll be looking at depletion of surface water that would affect surface water use. The sustainability goal is also something that the TAC will begin working on. This is really just a mission statement to guide sustainability. In each one of these steps, we're going to be reviewing sort of 3 things to get to our end here. And those 3 things are the requirements and the regulations, the application to the conditions within the Modesto subbasin. And we're also going to be considering what approach adjacent subbasins have taken to this. I think it's always helpful now that we have all of the critically overdrafted basins GSPs in front of us. And even though they haven't yet been approved, we can begin to understand how others have approached these terms, and that sometimes will spur ideas and discussion and information for application to the Modesto subbasin. So just beginning with the same 6 sustainability indicators, they're just simply reproduced and listed here. And if one of these sustainability indicators is determined to be significant and unreasonable, then that is our criteria for defining it as an undesirable result. So we're going to quickly walk through each of these 6 with a little bit of background on Modesto subbasin conditions. And we're going to begin by considering the first 2 sustainability indicators together. I think all of us can realize that there are a lot of interactions associated with these 6 sustainability indicators, but I tend to look at water levels and the associated groundwater and storage associated with those water levels. I think sometimes that's helpful to sort of consider those together. So let's get right into the chronic lowering of water level. I've just kind of explained chronic lowering of water level in my own terms here on the left of this little cartoon. We're looking at something that indicates a long-term decline over average hydrologic conditions. And even if water levels have stabilized or recovered during wet periods, that doesn't mean that they're not continuing to be chronically lowered during dry conditions. Chronic indicates long lasting. So we will be using hydrographs that we have pulled from the basin setting, and I'm not going to show any of those today, but we're going to dive into those in our next meeting. What I wanted to just quickly go through here is that this sustainability indicator is typically related to beneficial uses of wells. And so I have put a little diagram of a well just to remind everyone with respect to what we're looking at with how water levels relate back to beneficial uses of a well. So what I have here in my little cartoon is casing that goes down to a certain portion of the aquifer, and this sort of dashed area here is the screened portion. In other words, this is where groundwater can actually come into the well. We have a representation of a pump in this well that pulls water levels out and then goes to beneficial uses, in this case, agriculture or urban uses, but there are environmental uses as well that are not related necessarily to a well. But we're going to be focused for at least this initial approach on wells. There are a variety of ways that beneficial uses can be impacted, and it doesn't necessarily mean that this water level here has to fall all the way to the bottom of this well. There are a variety of ways that the well could be impacted that are more associated with the well. But for our purposes, we're going to be really focused on the aquifer. And we're going to ask ourselves these questions. Have water level declines that have occurred in the Modesto subbasin affected the beneficial use of wells? And in particular, we just went through the drought of record. This gives us a litmus test, so to speak, for very low water levels. And during that time period, did we have dry wells? Did we have operational issues? Do we have water quality concerns associated with these water level declines? And if so, are these just adverse impacts that can be managed, or are they truly undesirable results? In other words, we're really causing conditions here that we want to avoid. And we will ask ourselves again, not only for domestic wells, but also for municipal wells, if the impacts can be managed or mitigated, and if so, how. The county did a very useful thing during the drought of record. The county responded to well owners that had problems with respect to water level declines. And during the 2014 to 2017, as you recall, the drought of record, very low water levels within the subbasin, the county responded to any domestic well owner that actually had problems with their wells. It was called a dry well program. Doesn't mean that the wells were all dry, but it means that in some ways that they had some failure that appeared to be associated with a water level decline. The county noted right away that many of these wells were more than 50 years old, which sometimes will indicate a very inefficient well. They also indicated that many of the wells that failed were incredibly shallow and really not equipped to handle domestic water use as well. There were assistance from the county for helping domestic well owners understand the process for installing new wells. And there was also some financial resources provided for water tank installations to allow the well to pump during certain periods of time and then store the water for future use. Some of these wells have likely been deepened or replaced. It's very difficult to match well to well as to whether the failed well has specifically been replaced. but we suspect that there are additional wells in the area that could potentially fail during water level declines. And so we'll be bringing back to this group additional information on depth of the remaining domestic wells in the subbasin and how water level declines may impact those wells.
Hey, Phyllis, can I just, I know you're in the group here. Can I ask a question of Walt? When you, the county, provided assistance with new wells, I'm assuming that there was some level of follow-up on the county's behalf. Do you have the well completion reports for that, or do you know the infrastructure that was put in, how the well was deepened, all of those type things?
Yeah, we do. We have copies of the applications, and for the wells that were completed, we'll have the completion reports.
Okay.
What got created was the backlog. There's only so much drilling capacity. And one of the first things we ran into was the air carb regs, which restricted the number of engine run hours. So that got lifted so they could go 24/7. But and as soon as that happened, it created a backlog of about 18 months. So while Walter Ward's well may have been dry and it's 50 years old and less than 100 feet deep, you know, what do you do to wait around 18 months for water? So, you know, the tank programs and the financial assistance and all that were put in place. But the important part is the well that went dry was indeed replaced with a deeper well, and we do have records on that.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And then thinking also about wells and how they would relate back to this reduction of groundwater and storage. You can think about sort of these, we have a high water level that we see in the subbasin, the historic low that we've seen in the subbasin. And I think of these, the general wells that are capable of accessing groundwater and storage as being sort of the operational storage. But we do have a large volume of fresh water beneath this subbasin that goes down more than 1,000 feet in some areas down to a base of fresh water. So we'll be thinking about the volumes of groundwater that are in storage beneath the Modesto subbasin, sort of using this cartoon diagram as a guide. And really there are, I think technically there are two considerations to think about with respect to groundwater and storage. The regulations specifically talk about a depletion of supply. In other words, will we run out of water? And I think that the answer for that is that there's a very low chance of that would occur. Historically, we have used up, so to speak, only a relatively small percentage of the available fresh water beneath us in the subbasin, but rather we will run out of sort of capacity with the wells to be able to access that storage. And so we'll be thinking again with respect to access and wells. There's also, when I think of the reduction of groundwater and storage, I immediately think of the water budgets and the issue of overdraft. And so I always think about talking about overdraft with respect to this sustainability indicator. And that is thinking more along the lines of, is the basin being managed within its sustainable yield? So overdraft is not the only component of sustainable yield. Sustainable yield simply is defined by SGMA as no undesirable results. So there are other sustainability indicators to consider for sustainable yield, but the regulations do specifically require that the subbasins look at mitigation of overdraft. So that's something that we're going to be talking about a little bit as well with respect to this sustainability indicator.
Hey,
Any
Phyllis,
questions on that?
Yeah, actually, that's a good time. Are you open to taking questions as we go here today?
Please, I think that's the right way to go.
Okay, Stacy Henderson has her hand up. So Stacy, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Phyllis, thanks for your presentation. I think this is really helpful. I just had a question with respect to the criteria. Are you looking at this criteria, or are we as a GSA looking at this criteria on a basin-wide basis, or are we looking at it within each of the 4 management areas that we have?
So we've not actually defined specific management areas. We have used the model to define management zones, to do the zone budgets. And we're going to be setting these metrics throughout the entire subbasin, but they will vary from location to location. So I think what you're getting at is, we've talked a lot about how groundwater conditions vary significantly throughout the subbasin, and I interpret your question, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, that really asking, are we going to consider that there are a lot of different conditions throughout this subbasin? And the answer to that is yes, that would occur because we're going to be setting these criteria at specific wells that will be part of our GSP monitoring network. And so just to continue on that thought a little bit to try to better answer the question. So we might decide, for example, that in some areas we need water levels to remain high to support local wells, for example, or to at least not fall below a certain level in that area. And then there are other parts of the subbasin where water levels could potentially fall lower. But recognizing that the whole subbasin is connected, we'll have to consider those hydraulic connections as part of the criteria. But it does allow you to lower water levels in some areas and keep them higher in others. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Yep, that makes sense. And that's exactly what I was looking for. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else with respect to the chronic lowering of water levels or reduction of groundwater in storage?
I don't see any hands up in the audience, and member agencies can always chime in. So Phyllis, let's carry on.
Hey,
All right, great.
Oh, there we go. Walt, it sounds like Walt.
Am I supposed to raise my hand or something?
No, just go ahead and talk, Walt.
Hey, Phyllis, I don't want to overcomplicate this, but at some point I think it's important to introduce to the discussion the concept of the MTs and the MOs, and the idea that exceeding the minimum thresholds over time could lead to the conclusion that significant and unreasonable drawdown has created an undesirable result, whereas you can operate between your MO and MT, recognizing that dry and wet years will still occur, and we're still going to have drawdown and recovery. Groundwater is not static, and it will move up and down and change over time. Anyway, the MT MO, I think, is at some point I think it's necessary to bring into the discussion.
Absolutely. And I didn't focus on that today because I wanted to give an overview of all of the sustainability indicators, but we are going to be talking about that. The added complication that we'll be talking about as well is that, and this goes back a little bit to Stacy's question, so I wanted to just quickly go through this now without a slide, and that is this, that we have, the GSAs have the discretion to determine real specifically how to define undesirable results. And in particular, they can add additional information to the assignment of minimum thresholds and measurable objectives with respect to space and time. So I think this is, again, what Stacy was referring to, is that, can this be changed over the area? And so what an example of that might be that perhaps we'll have a framework for a minimum threshold that says that the undesirable result definition is if we exceed a specific minimum threshold in a certain number of wells for a certain period of time. And I think this is the flexibility that's really needed with respect to a groundwater basin, so that you don't have one well falling 6 inches below a minimum threshold that would trigger an undesirable result, when in reality, one well may not be an undesirable result. One well might be, but I just wanted to point out that we have that kind of flexibility to incorporate into the definition of undesirable results. Does that help, Walt? Was that the kind of thing you were referring to?
Exactly. The concept that one time, at one place doesn't in and of itself create a non-compliance issue.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to move on then to the next sustainability indicator, which is the degradation of water quality. And this sustainability indicator perhaps is one of the most interesting because it potentially overlaps so many other things that are going on with respect to water quality in the state. And so this is a summary of a guideline that was put out by Stanford Water in the West, and it marries nicely with the regulations as well as the BMPs put out by the Department of Water Resources. And it actually provides, at least for me when I read through this, it provides quite a bit of clarity as to how the GSAs may decide to approach the sustainability indicator. And I just have some conclusions or some observations, as you will, from this guideline that I've put here. For one thing, California legislature has already designated other agencies as the primary state agency for responsibility for groundwater quality. The GSAs don't really have the mandate nor the authority to duplicate those programs. In addition, GSAs are not responsible for fixing, so to speak, undesirable results for water quality or for any of the sustainability indicators that were already present before the SGMA baseline of January 1st, 2015. So the historical and some of the legacy water quality issues that are already being dealt with by other regulatory programs is something that we would not take responsibility for. But certainly in your GSP, you have characterization of groundwater quality, and you're going to want to confer and coordinate with these programs so that we can make sure we're all on the same page. And that's what is generally recommended in this guideline over and over again. And so I've reproduced some of that information to confer with other regulatory agencies on water quality and desirable results. And that the potential impacts of water qualities from any GSP projects or management actions are the responsibility of the GSA to determine. For example, if you decide to have a recharge project, you would need to go through all of the regulatory requirements for permitting and conferring and coordinating, of course, with the State Water Resources Control Board, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and others on water quality associated with those projects. And then if adverse impacts should occur from GSA actions, then the GSAs are the ones to consider ways to avoid or mitigate those water quality problems, of course. Again, coordinating with the primary agencies responsible for groundwater quality. So there's a lot of coordination here and a lot of I think in the past, it's been my observation that sometimes these kinds of issues are siloed within maybe a county department or the DTSC or the regional board. And I think that this guidance is simply suggesting that the GSAs have a wonderful opportunity to be able to actually coordinate a lot of these actions that are occurring in their groundwater basin together. Part of this collaboration has already begun because Perry Klassen and John Davids coordinated the presentation that Perry gave us in December from the Valley Water Collaborative, which is, again, a nonprofit pulling together a lot of information and implementation steps for the irrigated lands regulatory program. So recognizing that that program is specifically scoped to look at nitrate exceedances within the groundwater quality of the subbasin, then obviously the GSAs would be encouraged to continue to coordinate with those efforts. This guidance also has 7 recommendations as a sort of conclusion. And I wanted to put the picture here just so that you could, this is very easy to find online, and it's a really excellent guide, and it explains it better than I would be able to. I've just summarized the 6 conclusions and recommendations here. But again, you'll just see over and over again, consider what the others are doing. Consider local standards for the minimum thresholds. Confer with those agencies, and develop supplemental groundwater monitoring networks as necessary, using other groundwater monitoring programs in your GSP network as well. So again, just the confer, the considerations and coordination with other programs to make sure that we have everything covered with respect to water quality, potential undesirable results in the Modesto subbasin. Anything on groundwater quality that you'd like to talk about here? This sometimes can be a little tricky, and a lot of subbasins have gone in the direction of simply recognizing, documenting, and incorporating many of these other water quality monitoring programs as part of your GSP. Moving on to seawater intrusion. I just have one slide here. I have a little depiction here of seawater intrusion in its classic form, which is more along the lines of a coastal basin and a little freshwater wedge with seawater shown below. And I pulled 3 quotes from the regulations related to seawater intrusion sustainability indicator. And I pulled specific words there that I thought might be helpful for your initial consideration of this sustainability indicator. So the definition of the seawater intrusion sustainability indicator in the GSP involves this phrase: the advancement of seawater into a groundwater supply. The regulations specifically say that the minimum threshold, I've continually used MT to be minimum threshold throughout these slides, that the MT shall be defined by a chloride concentration isocontour, anticipating that seawater, which is high chloride, is being documented as coming into the groundwater basin. And then finally, that the minimum threshold has to consider the effects of current and projected sea levels. And there's just the reference from the regulations on those. So these words, to me, from a technical perspective only, indicate that this is referring to a coastal basin connected to the ocean. We do have coastal areas, coastal groundwater basins in the state, several of which are being impacted by seawater intrusion. I would like for the GSA to consider whether or not they feel like that this is applicable to the Modesto subbasin. From a technical perspective, I think that the regulations are anticipating that it is conditions that would not apply to you specifically. We had this discussion in the Turlock subbasin. I thought it was a very helpful discussion that you might consider as well. The Turlock subbasin GSA members said, well, we don't have the ocean next to us, but we do have a base of fresh water at depth, and we have high salinity groundwater beneath that base of fresh water. And if we lower water levels and decrease pressures, there would be the potential in the future for causing upwelling of perhaps some of that connate high salinity water. And I say, yes, that is the case. Walt, did you have something you wanted to say?
We could cut to the chase here pretty quick. I mean, saline ekponing is not seawater intrusion. And
Right.
Seems to me that we can eliminate this altogether and focus on the 5 that remain, address it in the GSP and explain why, but really not spend any more time on it.
Any other comments from the TAC members on that?
Well, I think that's that may be true, Walt, but I guess I'd like to hear Phyllis out today. Just finish her thought with respect to this slide. And then, not to say that I don't agree with you from a technical perspective, but I'd like to hear Phyllis, if folks are okay with it, hear Phyllis finish her thought.
Yes, and actually Walt almost finished my thought for me, which was the Turlock subbasin, again, was concerned about the upconing, and my recommendation from a technical perspective to them was that if we have that condition within the Turlock subbasin or the Modesto subbasin, that could be handled through degraded water quality. So it isn't as if we would ignore it, nor is it that we would not say that it could ever occur. We would just, again, exactly as Walt just said, not define that as seawater intrusion, which is why I put these words from the regs that indicate to me from a technical perspective, this is really talking about the ocean rather than deep saline water. And I'll just finish the thought with respect to the Turlock subbasin. The TAC members in the Turlock subbasin agreed, and they determined that they would handle that through degraded water quality and would not use the seawater intrusion sustainability indicator to define the deep saline upconing. And as a result of that, they're making a recommendation to their GSA, both of their GSAs in the subbasin, to determine that the seawater intrusion sustainability indicator is not applicable to the Turlock subbasin. And I would make a recommendation that the TAC members here consider the same for the Modesto subbasin.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, and seems to make a lot of sense. Are there folks, member agencies that feel otherwise, given what you've heard today? Okay, well, take the next 5 minutes to think about it, and then let me know. No, I'm only kidding.
We will have another bite at the apple at the next meeting. So
undoubtedly we will. Okay.
Yes. All right, great. Well, thank you for that. And let's move on to the next sustainability indicator, which is land subsidence. And the way that I wanted to start with land subsidence is to quickly go through the concepts of land subsidence again with you, because in the Central Valley where you're located, in particular, the Corcoran clay has been associated with inelastic land subsidence issues. And the diagram that's shown here shows this sort of regional clay layer depicted in the subsurface and an area of the largest land subsidence associated with the Corcoran clay area. And what's happening here is that we see that there are fine-grained materials in the subsurface in the aquifer. And if there is a concentration of these fine-grained materials, such as there would be, especially in a regional clay layer, then as water levels fall within a groundwater basin, the pressure is released with respect to these zones, and the aquifer system actually gives itself an opportunity to compact. And this compaction of clays, it's a rearrangement sort of the little particles in the aquifer system. And in this compaction in the subsurface, in the aquifer system, actually allows the land surface to go down in elevation. And so this surface expression was because we had compaction at depth in the aquifer. And in the Central Valley, this compaction has been well documented to be part of relationships to the Corcoran clay. So with those concepts in mind, I have a couple of additional slides for this. One is the areas of subsidence that have been recently mapped out from the INSAR data. This is the satellite imagery data that NASA and JPL have put together. And we are located up here, as you can see, and most of the areas that have been determined to be of large land subsidence are well south of us. But they are in the same area beneath the Corcoran clay that is in our western portion of subbasin as well. And so while we may not have subsidence that has been documented in our subbasin, and that's primarily likely because water levels have not declined significantly in the western portion of your subbasin, and in particular, they have not declined enough to dewater or to reduce pressure significantly within the Corcoran clay. And so as a result of that, you haven't been documenting any land subsidence within your subbasin because it hasn't yet occurred. However, the regulations don't only look at whether or not it's occurring now, but whether or not there's the potential for occurrence in the future. And so what I have done on this slide is pull additional INSAR data. INSAR, it stands for Interferometric Synthetic Aperture Resolution, and it has to do with changes, very minute changes in the land surface as interpreted from satellite imagery data. And the Department of Water Resources has commissioned additional INSAR data to be posted on their data viewer website. So I pulled this. This is DWR commissioned INSAR data on their data website, and they're going to be doing this on an ongoing basis. So one of the ideas that I had, and I suggested this to the Turlock subbasin, who's in a similar situation where they don't have documented subsidence either, but they do have an area, and again, mostly west of this red line where there's Corcoran clay in the subsurface, this regional clay layer, where this could potentially be used on an ongoing basis for screening to see if additional areas show up. For land subsidence, you're not just looking at little pieces, you're looking at something that is an overall aquifer decline of water levels. And so we see this spotty area here. So let me talk a little bit about this. You can see the vertical displacement scale that's shown here. These data cover a 3-year time period. And the gray is essentially zero changes over time in the land surface elevation. Now, we do have some changes indicated, and they're in the eastern portion of the subbasin, especially in areas where we're not even pumping. And so this is odd, and others have looked at it in the eastern basin as well. So what we have to remember is that these data are elevation changes. Number one, they're very, very small. You can see here that the scale indicates that this larger yellow area is only 0.05 feet over this 3-year period. So tenths of inches. And you can imagine that there's some uncertainty and there's some error associated with the data at these very, very minute millimeter levels with respect to these INSAR data. And so again, you're looking for areas that correspond to areas where water levels have declined sort of regionally and over time, and in particular in areas where we know that to be problematic, which would be areas in the clay layers. So again, using these as screening data to do confirmation on the surface, I think is a way to handle the issues of potential land subsidence. And in particular, we will be looking for you and bringing back to this group whether or not the elevation of the surface of the Corcoran clay, which again is present only in this western sort of third or quarter of the subbasin, whether or not water levels are falling close to the top of this Corcoran clay layer where it might be a higher potential for subsidence. So this is just sort of some technical information for the GSAs to consider as to how they may screen and monitor information in your subbasin for the potential for future subsidence, recognizing that you do not yet have any documented land subsidence identified in your subbasin.
Hey, Phyllis, this is John. So before we leave this slide, I just want to make sure, I think you've done from my perspective, a really good job explaining this slide. But if I'm, if I'm not doing groundwater every day, like some of us on this phone are, I look at, or I hear some of our previous discussions, and I know that non-district east is, their net extractors from the basin, and I marry that information with this slide, and I'm led to believe that the pumping that occurring is on the east side is causing, in fact, land subsidence. And I want to make sure that before we leave the slide, again, you've done a great job, but folks understand that's not the case. This is, there's no presence of the Corcoran clay in this area. And so it wouldn't, one could not assume that the net extractions in the non-district east are the cause of these changes. Is that fair?
That's right.
Yes, that was very well said. And again, using these data as a screening tool and then confirming, it would be the process rather than just jumping to the conclusion that this has occurred. Yeah, we do see these, and if I just focused on your sub-basin, but if I had shown the INSAR data, you see these spotty indications of elevation, land surface changes all along the eastern portion. And I think at this point, it's not likely related to inelastic land subsidence. It's certainly not related to the type of subsidence that we have seen be very problematic in the sub-basin with respect to the dewatering of clays.
John, I think too, it's important to point out where the Corcoran clay pinches out that red line and recognize west of that, you have two different types of aquifers. To the west of that, you have an unconfined aquifer that sits on top of the Corcoran clay, and then you have a confined aquifer underneath the Corcoran clay. It is not the pumping from the unconfined or the shallow aquifer that's of concern. It's the pumping from the confined aquifer beneath the Corcoran clay and the relationship of the potentiometric surface or the pressure surface of that confined aquifer compared to the top of the clay. So if we impose any kind of pumping restriction on the west side, it won't be for the drainage wells in the shallow unconfined aquifer. It'll be for the deeper confined aquifer, which is where the concern would be for subsidence.
Understood. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and we'll have to look at production wells on that side. My gut tells me that the production wells on that side are below the Corcoran because you end up getting better water quality there. Is that a fair statement?
Well, you get better water quality and recognize that likely the most direct source of recharge for the unconfined aquifer is either coming from the river systems or coming from the coast range, which is limited. The deeper recharge to the confined aquifer in the forebay is Sierra Nevada meltwater. And so the shallow aquifer will tend to not only have, it's not necessarily a water quality distinction, it just doesn't produce.
Okay. Good. Thank you, Walt.
But yes, thanks very much, Walt. You said that better than I did. And yes, I do think that in particular, if the GSAs, we will be able to look at where the water levels are with respect to the surface of the clay now, and we will be able to sort of think about management actions in the future that will make sure that we don't have inadvertent dewatering of the clay. Anything else on subsidence?
I don't see any questions from the attendees, Phyllis.
Okay, and our last sustainability indicator, depletion of interconnected surface water. I have just a little I have just a little diagram here that didn't want to stay up. There we go. Oh, it really doesn't want to stay up. I must have an animation associated with it. Oh. Look quickly, folks. Let's try again. Okay. So I have three little diagrams shown at the top of this slide that show gaining and losing in disconnected streams. Essentially, the one on the left is gaining, the one in the middle is losing, and the one on the end is losing as well. I'm not going to talk today about the difference between the losing stream and the disconnected stream because your river systems are generally interconnected surface water. In other words, they sometimes gain and they sometimes lose. And so I think in particular with respect to looking at your situation, we're really sort of considering gaining versus losing. Your historical water budget showed that you had gaining streams in general on three boundaries, that you had mostly gaining along the Tuolumne, the Stanislaus, and the San Joaquin rivers. Your projected future baseline, however, suggests that the Tuolumne and the Stanislaus rivers will transition from mostly gaining to mostly losing without management actions. And I should have, I see now when I read my own slide, I wish that I had said from mostly gaining to mostly losing in some areas, because it isn't everywhere with respect to the entire river reach, but it is certain reaches along these two rivers that have transitioned from gaining to losing. And you can see from the diagram how that might happen. In this particular diagram, water levels are high and gradients are toward the river. And you can see that the channel of the river is lower and the water level in the river is lower than you see in the adjacent areas of the groundwater system. So in those areas, water would naturally flow from high gradient to low gradient and feed the river system. Hence the word gaining, because your groundwater system is providing what we refer to as base flow to the river. As water levels decline on either side of the stream, in this simplistic diagram, we see it on both sides of the stream, then you get a situation where you have the gradients reversed, and the gradient in the river is actually higher than the gradient in the groundwater system. This causes recharge. It causes the water that's in the river to actually move beneath the river channel and feed the groundwater system. And if this happens over a long enough period of time, this saturated zone actually moves beneath the channel and becomes disconnected. But in these two cases, you are still predominantly recharging water from the river system down into the groundwater system. Now, these conditions happen naturally. Both of these conditions happen naturally, gaining and losing along your river channels now. And the predictions that the modeling shows is that if water levels continue to decline in certain areas of your subbasin, and if no projects and management actions are instituted to keep those declines from occurring, then some areas might transition into a losing stream. What this means, this may not be a problem if it's a small amount, and if the recharge is sort of displacing surface water use. But over time, the stream depletion that's occurring because of these water level declines will affect predominantly water rights holders in the river and or the ecosystem that relies on riparian and or groundwater being fed from below, groundwater dependent ecosystems, so to speak. So those are the two sort of beneficial uses that we need to consider with respect to any depletion of stream flow that might occur in the future. Now, I'll just hurry up and say that this is predicted by a 50-year modeling run with a lot of assumptions embedded. So it doesn't mean that the sky is falling, but it does mean that we want to be careful with respect to where water levels are close to the streams, such that we don't cause stream flow depletion that would be defined by the TAC and by the GSAs as undesirable results. Any questions on this one slide before I leave it?
I'll only say that this is an important issue from my perspective. So, you know, as we continue to advance our discussions and coordinate with our neighbors to the north and the south, this to me is an important discussion that we'll be having.
I appreciate that. It is an important discussion, and it's one that I didn't necessarily predict would happen. But here is the manifestation of what it looks like when you graph out the water budget. You might recall, everyone, that we had a historical water budget that was average hydrologic conditions from water year 1991 through water year 2015. And the blue that's shown on this water budget is shown as a negative with respect to this groundwater budget. And what that refers to is stream aquifer interaction. And when the blue is shown on the negative portion of the graph, in other words, down here on the bottom portion of this historical graph, it means that the water from the river is actually gaining from the groundwater system. That's why the groundwater system is showing the blue as a loss. So these water budgets, if you're looking at a water budget for surface water versus a water budget of groundwater, you have to kind of twist your brain around with respect to this. But blue on the bottom here means that the groundwater system is losing water to the rivers. So a loss to the rivers is that gaining situation that we talked about. In other words, this is base flow. So this is supporting the river system. But you can see that as we move into the future baseline, this 50 years, recall that we've been talking about, we just in December looked at the results of this. As you go into this period, you begin to see that the blue, which was actually feeding groundwater to the river, is now jumping to the positive portion of this groundwater system. And that means that the groundwater system is now pulling water out of the river. And this is recharge that is being a positive, net positive to the groundwater system. So we move from a gaining stream net. This is not everywhere, not every river, not every month, but a net annual gain to the rivers. We move to net annual loss to the rivers. And one of the things that we see is that water levels, especially in the Tuolumne and in the lower Stanislaus as well, were pretty close to the bottom of the channels. So it doesn't take, you can imagine that if, you know, we go back to our diagram that wouldn't stay up, and we see that, you know, if the water level is close to this, then you can see that it could move up and down a few feet and sometimes intersect the bottom and sometimes not intersect the bottom. So that's really what we're seeing over time, is that there's enough of a water level decline over this 50-year period that we begin to see more water being lost from the stream rather than water being added to the stream. Does this make sense? And does anybody have any comments on this?
Looks like we have one from, excuse me, MID Director John Mensinger. John, go ahead.
So I would like to observe that our friends at the State Water Resources Control Board are proposing regulations that would require more water to flow down the Stanislaus and Tuolumne rivers. So this might help make up for the groundwater, the rivers losing water to the groundwater basin. And so I'm asking if that has been factored in the calculations for the future. The other thing I would observe is that, oddly enough, if the river is adding into our groundwater, that is a benefit to our groundwater basin, I suppose. It's a negative to the river. And we could make it up to the river by increasing flows from the river, you know, from our releases from our dams.
So I'll take a stab at that, Director Mensinger. I think this really materializes as an issue in my mind from a compliance perspective. So Just speaking from the Tuolumne side of things, you know, right now our flow compliance point is immediately downstream of LaGrange Diversion Dam. And so and of course that's, you know, there are desires in the state to move that compliance point down further. But if, you know, I think the issue here is that if we were to, under this scenario, if we were, let's go back into the historical conditions. If we were to release 100 units of water at LaGrange Diversion Dam previously, we may end up with 120 units in Modesto, just for illustrative purposes. If we release that same 100 units into the future, then we may end up with 90 units in Modesto. And so I think you've hit the nail on the head with respect to this being a big issue. And I see it more from a compliance flow measurement perspective as we begin to advance into the future, specifically related to our flow obligations in the lower Tuolumne River. Does that make sense, John?
Yeah, so the only other thing I would observe is simply that that there's an opportunity here over the long run for us to take management actions to adjust for these things. In other words, if oddly enough, and also again, and the goal is sustainable groundwater. But if we have sustainable groundwater, I presume that if we avoid the aquifer being lowered, correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume it's that there's less likelihood and less quantity of rivers losing water to the groundwater.
That's
Correct.
true. That's a true statement. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, correct. Thank you. Thank you very much for amplifying those items. You're absolutely right. This is benefiting when the stream is losing. It does benefit. It adds water to the groundwater system. And just to make sure that all of your questions were addressed there, the SED flows that the State Water Resources Control Board are not included in this model run right here. This is a baseline without the SED flows associated with that. So this is just what the model is predicting would happen if we continue with our same land use policies and do nothing for the future.
But this discussion and Director Mensinger, your questions is exactly why I think it's an important discussion for us as we advance our sustainable groundwater management activities and begin to think about those management actions.
Great, thanks very much for that discussion. And then there's also the issue of groundwater dependent ecosystems. And I just wanted to mention that because it's a requirement of the GSP for you to identify your groundwater dependent ecosystems. And so just because I'm not exactly changing topics, I'm still talking about interconnected surface water in general, but a groundwater dependent ecosystem is a little bit different. It's referring to ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from the aquifer or groundwater occurring near the surface. So it could be and is often related to interconnected surface water, but it isn't necessarily. Sometimes there's just areas of shallow groundwater that are capable of reaching the root zones of native plants and provide a water source for these plants and animals. The regulations require that we identify GDEs within the basin, and the specific language is utilizing data available from the department. And what that quote means is the document that's shown on this slide on the right. This came out in April 2018 and was developed by the Department of Water Resources in cooperation with a variety of other state agencies, including the Nature Conservancy and California Fish and Wildlife and others, to develop a summary of the natural communities commonly associated with groundwater. We call these the NCAG maps. And what they are GIS polygons that have been identified throughout the entire state that show areas of where these natural communities exist that may be associated with the groundwater system. And these are available for the Modesto subbasin. They're in your the draft GSP now. We've discussed them in the basin setting section of your GSP. And most of your polygons that have been identified by DWR and others are along the rivers. And the concept here is, are they being fed by groundwater beneath the river? Again, that last bullet on this slide, that the groundwater dependent ecosystems are often related to interconnected surface water, such as gaining streams. But they may also simply be using water on a riparian basis from the stream itself. So either way, stream flow depletion could potentially affect these communities of ecological communities that have developed along your river systems. I just note that going down the Tuolumne, there are, stands of willows and stands of cottonwoods in certain areas and oaks. And these are likely related to the potential for being harmed during stream flow depletion, if the stream flow depletion is significant enough. So again, we certainly have water rights issues, which are very important with respect to the surface water, but we also have the potential for ecological use of the stream flow as well. Any questions on that or anything else related to interconnected surface water? I'm almost done here.
Yes, actually, Phyllis, it looks like Hillary has a question. Hillary, go ahead.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. I was wondering if you were planning on doing any ground truthing of the GDEs as they've been mapped.
Well, the short answer is generally no. And I say that and then laugh, because there will be a need for some reconnaissance work to be done. So the all of these polygons, so there are thousands of polygons of natural communities. So it would be a rather time-consuming endeavor to do ground truthing for each of them. Many of them can be done with respect to just simply evaluating conditions of stream flow along the rivers. Some of the inland ones, however, and there are not very many of those in this Modesto subbasin, some of the inland ones will probably be communicated with the agencies. For example, for the several that are within MID, probably coordinate with MID, and we can maybe get some ground truthing done for several of those. Sometimes these natural communities are associated with a wastewater treatment plant discharge, which would not be a natural community, or an area of a recharge basin, which again would not be a natural community. It would be, something that's artificial and man-supported and man-made. Sometimes there are communities that have been mapped that are associated with either spills from a canal or from, just simply agricultural runoff. And so we want to eliminate those areas if we feel like that we can fully support that they are not groundwater dependent ecosystems. But rather than going from location to location, which would again be incredibly time consuming and difficult to do, we're going to be looking at them on a more of a holistic standpoint. For example, there would not be the potential for these natural communities to be groundwater dependent ecosystems if we look at water levels historically that could not possibly be supporting the root zone. For example, if during high water levels and low water levels, the groundwater system is more than, say, 30 feet below the ground surface, then any natural communities in that area would not likely be supported by groundwater, but would rather be supported by some surface water source. So there will be some of that done, but it will be done in a very cursory way. The reality here is that this information came out very late, and all of the work plans for the GDEs had already been put together prior to these polygons showing up. So we're going to do the best that we can to move this along, but the identification process will not be polygon by polygon. That was a really long-winded answer to Hillary's question. Hillary, did that make sense?
And it's obviously a complicated issue. I have seen some of these GDEs where, and when I've talked to the farmer or landowner, they've said that, you know, it's not necessarily a GDE, it's more of a tailwater system return system or a duck club or, you know, something else that's causing what looks like a GDE. And so I think ground truthing, or at least talking to the owners in some of these areas where there's a question, is probably a benefit and a good thing to do. Keep the community involved and to really outline where these GDEs are existing.
Agreed. And this is going to be an ongoing task going forward. The regulations require that they be quote unquote identified as potential GDEs. And so in a lot of ways, we already have that done as these potential GDEs. And now it's a matter of, as you said, going from location to location and eliminating those which are actually not GDEs.
Gotcha.
Thank you for that question. So that was my attempt at the whirlwind view of all 6 sustainability indicators. Here is the overall process. Again, you've seen this slide before, but I just think sometimes it's helpful to kind of review where we are. So analyzing these sustainability indicators is the first step, and we've done that in several PowerPoints now, sort of applying conditions from the basin setting. We will continue to do this, and we will look to the GSAs to tell the technical team what details would be helpful to them to make these decisions. I can provide what I think is reasonable, but there may be some things as we go through this process that the GSAs will say, you know, could we have additional information on one issue or another? And so this will be a sort of moving target as we go, but we do need to start defining for ourselves what conditions for these sustainability indicators that we really want to avoid. And that is our definitions of undesirable results. So we need to start doing that, and we'll begin doing that in the next month with respect to chronic lowering of water levels, which will be, I think, one thing that we will tackle first. If you just look at everything that we talked about today, we have sort of an approach for water quality that we've talked about, an approach for seawater intrusion that we've talked about, an approach for subsidence that we've talked about, and then the interconnected surface water is going to be ongoing, associated with some of the modeling that we're going to continue to do. So I think it's appropriate that if we can get undesirable results and minimum thresholds identified for chronic lowering of water levels and reduction of groundwater and storage, we're really biting off sort of the first 2 sustainability indicators that we need to get a handle on. The measurable objective, I've not talked very much about that, and at the next meeting we will dive into what the minimum threshold and measurable objective and the metrics for these sustainability indicators look like. But measurable objective simply gives you a buffer between where you're operating and what the minimum threshold is, so that you can recognize when you're getting close to a minimum threshold in certain areas. It's sort of operational flexibility. Measurable objective is sort of where you generally will be managing the basin, and minimum threshold is something that you actually want to avoid. Depending on where you are with respect to the progress towards sustainable management, you will be selecting interim milestones. We'll do that last after we know what minimum thresholds are and what measurable objectives are and kind of where we're headed. Then we'll put out a plan at the end to say how fast we can achieve various steps toward obtaining these measurable objectives that we've defined over the 20-year planning horizon. Any questions about my little 5-step, here's what we're doing slide?
I don't have any, Phyllis. I think this has been a really good introduction today. Are there questions from member agencies? Okay, how about from the public? I don't see any hands up. Oh, sorry, did I cut somebody off there? Okay, doesn't sound like it. Okay, if there are no further questions for Phyllis, thank you for your presentation today.
Thank you.
And that takes us to item number 5 on the Technical Advisory Committee meeting agenda for today, which is determination of our next Technical Advisory Committee meeting. Phyllis, are we ready to do that now, or do we need to talk offline? Do we want to just schedule the next TAC to coincide with the next standing monthly meeting of the GSA? Is that your preference?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So fair enough. So I don't have, let me get my calendar out, and that will be on February the 10th. We will reconvene the regular monthly meeting of the Stanislaus and Tuolumne Rivers Groundwater Basin Association, GSA, and then immediately following, as we did today, we'll have a Technical Advisory Committee meeting. So thanks to everybody for their time and attention today, and we will talk to you all soon. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.